This is the solution for the Person UI challenge. For this challenge, we are to use a GitHub repository. So I'm going to go to GitHub and create my repository first. Clicking on New Repository, I'm going to name it Person Space UI, which will get translated into Person-UI. The description is the solution to the Person UI challenge. It's going to be public. I'm going to initialize it with a README and a gitignore file based on the Swift version of gitignore. So I'm going to create that repository, and then I'm going to take the gitignore and edit it and add in the other section .ds_store, because I want those ignored. I'm going to commit this with .dsstore added to gitignore, and I'm going to commit this directly to the master branch. So I commit the changes, and I have my updated gitignore. So this is my starting repository. I'm going to click the clone or download and copy the HTTPS URL for the repository. Open up my terminal, and I'm going to go to Documents, Projects, iOS. And here I want to clone that repository. So I'm going to say git clone and the URL. And if I type ls-al, I now have person-UI directory, which is where I have my Git repository project listed. So now I'm ready to create my Xcode project. So I'm going to say create new Xcode project. We are told to do an iOS single view application, and the product name is going to be Person UI. You can put in whatever organizational name and identifier you want. This is going to be Swift language universal devices. So click next, going to the Person UI directory and creating my project there. This project has us doing the interface builder interface using auto layout constraints for an interface that's shown here. Name, age, gender, the 21 are labels. This is a text field. This is a slider, segmented control, text area. And this name label is going to be the first thing I'm going to place. Is going to serve as an anchor for these other elements so that they're related to one another. And we see here a list of the UI elements and the constraints that we're to add. So I'm going to have that ready to go, and then I'm going to open the main storyboard. Here's my view controller, blank and ready to go. And as I said, the first thing I want to place here is the name label. So I'm going to search for label, drag it in some distance down and over from the top left, and it says that the label that contains name is 10 points below the top layout guide and 20 points from the left margin of the super view. So I'm going to select it, hold the control key down, and click drag diagonally without getting it right on top of the top layout guide, just below that. And if I do it diagonally, I am able to make two choices, one for the horizontal, one for the vertical. So I'm going to hold the shift key down because I'm making two choices. And I want vertical space to the top layout guide, and that's going to be 10. And then we're going to set that after we're done. And then we're going to have leading space to container margin, and say add constraints. And I can select the constraint here. I could go to the ruler and view the constraints, or I can double click on the blue line for the constraint. And so I wanted this to be 10 points below the top layout guide, so I make that 10, hit enter, click off of it, and then on the leading side, and you notice we're over from the margin, so there's space made for the margin, so we're starting at the margin. Currently it's 19 points over from the margin, and according to the documentation on the constraints, we want it to be 20 points from the left margin, so we're going to set that to 20. And now the label is set. I want to show you an alternative to what I just did, so I'm going to select and delete these two constraints, select the label again, and I'm going to this icon, the one that says Add New Constraints, and I'm going to click on it, and it's going to leave the checkbox Constrain to Margins, so that when we're doing the leading side, we want to be a distance from the margin, that'll be supported. So I'm going to click this. This is going to be relative to the margin, and it is currently listed as 20 points from the margin because that's what we previously set, but I could type whatever number I want in there. And then when I click the top, this is 10 points down, and it's from the top layout guide. So 20 points over from the margin, 10 points down from the top layout guide, add two constraints. And we have that first label set. And this is to contain the word name, colon. So we have that set. The next is there is a text field that is going to be to the right of name. So I'm going to search for the text field and drag it in and kind of place it so I get a dotted line relative to name so that it's vertically aligned with name. I'm going to drop it, and that text field to the right of the name is to be 10 points away from the label. So I could select this, control click drag from it to name and say horizontal spacing. And right now, because I have the ruler selected while I have the text field selected, I can edit this constraint. I could also do it by double clicking here, but I'm going to do it by selecting it and clicking edit over here. And so that is going to be 10 points over. So we're going to hit 10. And then we are going to want the text field centered vertically on the label. So I'm going to select this again, control click drag to the label, select center vertically, and now it's centered vertically. And then on the other side, the text field is 0 points from the right margin of the super view. I could do that by control click drag this way and saying trailing space, or I could select this and do the add constraints, select this right side, the trailing side, set it to 0, make sure that I'm constraining to margin, so I'm going to be 0 from the margin, add one constraint, and there we go. We are centered on name, 10 points over, and 0 points on the trailing side from the margin. So next, we're going to place age. So I'm going to get a label again, drag it below the name. I'm going to be lining them up on their colons here on the trailing side, so I might as well place it so the dotted line there indicates that I'm lined up on the trailing side. Drop the label. I'm going to actually enter age colon in it right now so we can see what that looks like. And for age, we are going to want the constraints to be, it says the label that contains age is 20 points below the label above it. So I can select age, control click drag to name, and say vertical spacing. If I click on the blue line, that's currently 23, but I want it to be 20. I could also have selected age, selected the ruler, and then gone here and said edit and set the 20 right here. So age is 20 points below the label above it. The trailing edge of age is aligned with the trailing edge of the name label so that the colons line up. So we're a certain distance down, but we don't know how far over we're supposed to be. So we're going to control click drag from age to name, and we want the trailing edges to line up. So I'm going to select trailing, and you see age popped right over there and aligned itself on the trailing edge. So that takes care of age. We then have a slider, and the slider continues until it runs into this label on the right side. Instead of doing the slider next, I'm going to do this label next, and then I'm going to constrain the slider between the age label and the label that contains 21. So I'm going to take a label and drag it up here. It's going to be vertically centered on age, aligned on the trailing side, that is the right side, with the margin. Leave up on it, and I'm going to double click, type 21 in there. I can kind of drag this over there. So I don't have constraints on it yet, and I need to set them. The constraints that are to be set on the 21 are 0 points from the right margin. So I'm going to select this. I could control click drag right, or I could select it, go down here, have constraint to margin set, choose the right side, the trailing side, and set it to 0 and say add one constraint, so we know where the edge of the label is. And it is to be centered vertically on age, because these are to be lined up. Now, even though they're lined up visually, and when I drag it around, we get those 3 little lines showing it lines up, there isn't a constraint that actually lines it up yet. So I'm going to control click drag from the 21 to age, and I'm going to say center vertically. So now 21 knows where it needs to be. It horizontally is positioned because it's got 0 distance to the right margin, and it's vertically aligned on age. So it knows horizontal position, vertical position, and because it's a label where we didn't set the width automatically becomes the content within it. So age and 21 are going to have a slider between them. So I'm going to go to the library and search for slider, and I'm going to drag it here in between 21 and age, and I'm going to also line it up with the text field above it, which should be about the right distance over from age. Leave up on that. So the slider is going to be a certain distance over from age. So there's supposed to be 10 points of space between age and the slider. So I'm going to take the slider, control click drag to age, and say horizontal spacing. Double click on, I accidentally zoomed there by accident, so I'm going to bring that back. And I'm going to double click on the little line, which is being hard to reach, and it is set to 10. So that number is good. I could also select the slider, go to the ruler, scroll down here, seeing leading space to age is 10. So that's exactly what we wanted. Between age and the slider is 10. The slider is vertically aligned with age. And so I might as well do that. Control click drag to age from the slider and center vertically. And then finally it said that there's also supposed to be 10 points between the slider and 21. So I'm going to take the slider, control click drag to the 21 and set the horizontal spacing. I'm going to double click on the blue line, or I could select the slider and go to the ruler and select the right constraint and hit edit. But I want the distance to be 10 points between the slider and the 21. So the slider now knows where it is supposed to be and how big it's supposed to be. The distance over from age and from 21 not only determines its position, but its width, and then centered vertically on age determines where it is in the vertical position. So all of the constraints it needs are set. The next item is a label that says gender. Take the label, drag it below age, get it to kind of line up like the other ones did. And that's not terribly important. I actually, just to prove a point, I'm going to drag this and drop it here. It's not nicely lined up. Let's see what happens if we just drop it there and then set the constraints. So gender, I can double click and type it, gender colon, is supposed to be 20 points below the label above it. Control click drag up to age, and we're doing vertical spacing. I can double click on this blue line, and it's supposed to be 20 points below. So we bring that into position. The trailing edge of gender is supposed to be aligned with the trailing edge of age. So we're going to select gender. The colon here and the colon there, the trailing side, the right side are supposed to line up. So we're going to control click drag from gender to age and say trailing. And that snapped gender into position. It knows how far down to be. It knows how far over to be. It knows its width because it's based on the content in it. So gender is set. Now to the right of gender is a segmented control. So I'm going to search for a segmented control and drag it into position to the right side, the trailing side of gender, and leave up. And it is to have female and male, so might as well handle that while I'm here. With it selected, I'm going to the inspector. Should have a pop-up here when you put your mouse over it. My pop-ups aren't appearing. There we go, the attributes inspector. So I'm going to select the attributes inspector. I do want 2 segments, and I'm going to turn off selected, so neither of them is selected. And then I'm going to click in the first one and type female, and click into the second one and type male. So if selected were enabled, then by default we'd have one selected. And if the user is making an initial choice, you shouldn't have one of them pre-selected. So here we have neither of them selected. So there is our segmented control, and it is supposed to be 10 points over from gender and vertically centered on it. So I'm going to control click drag from it to gender, hold the shift key down because I'm going to make 2 choices, horizontal spacing and center vertically, add those constraints. So now gender has male and female next to it. And then below it is going to be a text area, a text view. It's supposed to be 15 points below the segmented control, 0 points from the margin, and 0 points from the bottom layout guide. So we're going to type in text, grab a text view and drag it in, kind of put it against the one margin a little bit below the gender thing. And it says the text view is supposed to be 15 points below the segmented control. So I'm going to control click drag from the text view into the segmented control and click vertical spacing. With the text area selected and the ruler chosen, I'm going to edit the distance down, which we wanted to be 15. So then the next thing is the trailing, leading, and bottom. I'm going to do this by selecting it, going here to add new constraints, and we're doing the leading, trailing, and bottom. We want to constrain the margins. We want this to be relative to the bottom layout guide, and all 3 of these are 0. And I accidentally clicked off it before I was done, so let me go back here. All 3 of these are to be 0. Again, constrain the margins, and this bottom one is relative to the bottom layout guide. So say add 3 constraints, and there we have the text view. Now I did forget one thing as I'm looking at the UI. beside name is the text field, and in the text field it says enter name here. And that was specified. It says the text field to the right of name is to have a placeholder text that contains enter name here. I'm going to actually copy enter name here, and I'm going to select the text field and go to the attributes inspector, and then where it says placeholder text, I'm going to paste in enter name here, hit enter, and then that appears here in the user interface. Before I even test this, I'm going to go to source control and commit this. So with a message that says built user interface according to requirements document for challenge. And in addition to committing it, I'm going to push it to master on GitHub. So commit 12 files and push. And it's asking for my credentials on the repository. So now that I've committed and pushed it, make sure that everything I did is saved. I'm going to test this. So I'm going to run the simulator. And we're comparing it here to the original image. Everything seems to compare. And let's test to make sure this works in a rotated view. So I'm going to go to Hardware, Rotate Right. Notice that the text field stretches out, the slider stretches out between the two labels, and so does the text view. So we're 0 in from the margin. There isn't enough text to take us to the bottom. These are selectable, sliders movable. We don't have any code behind this yet, so there aren't any IB outlets and IB actions, but ultimately our goal is when this slider moves, whatever value the age is set to in the slider would appear here in the label. And we can enter a name in the text field. Let's rotate left, and everything looks good.